Agenda Alexandria. I'm Russ Bailey, Agenda's chair. Good evening. And first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to recognize some special guests this evening who are associated with tonight's topic, members of the Planning Commission and the Transportation Commission. From the Transportation Commission, Kevin Posey is in the back. And from the Planning Commission, Stuart Dunn is here, and Nate Masek, back there. Okay, welcome. And once again, it's nice to welcome back our team from Channel 70, Rodney Clark, Derek Limas, and Christian Limas. And our programs are shown weekly on Mondays and Saturdays at 9 p.m. and on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. The month following the program. Our members and guests are very active in the community, and we welcome their materials. If you have materials you'd like to put out on our display tables, the woman to see is in the back, Sherry Brown. And if you haven't joined Agenda Alexandria yet, this is an excellent time to do so. If you join over the next couple months, your membership is good for the end of this year and for the entirety of next year. Next month, we will be having our annual fireside chat. And it's going to be an evening with Judge Nolan Dawkins. As you know, Judge Dawkins doesn't speak often, so we're going to be very lucky to speak publicly often. So we're going to be lucky to have him here. We'll also be celebrating the sweet 16th birthday of Agenda Alexandria with champagne and the return of many of our former members that evening. Agenda does not, or only runs as well as it does because we have so many great sponsors. And I'd like to recognize them for their support. One of the things because of the sponsorship, one of the things we've been able to do this year is we've been basically able to keep our meal prices the same. And so we really appreciate the support that we've received. We have the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce. I didn't see Sherry here tonight. Nope. And An Yoon of State Farm Insurance, Barbara Anderson of the Life and Estate Planning Law Clinic, and David Speck, I know he's here, from Speck Codron Investment Group, and Frank Fannin of SunTrust is here, and I saw Gant Redmond here, right, from Redmond Peyton Braswell, yeah, and Lee Gary of Sotheby's International, and Tobin and Donna Walker James of Honest Air Heating and Air Conditioning, and Willem Pollock and Charlotte Hall of the Potomac River Boat Company, and William Ewell. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks. Okay. Tonight's program was organized by Tim Ahern, who unfortunately cannot be here this evening, and Mike Hobbs and Roger Waugh, and focuses on the Potomac Yard Metro. On track or off the rails? What are the issues that are shaping up, and should we or shouldn't we, and if so, where and how much, and all those other good things. And for those of you who have questions, and I suspect we'll have a number of questions tonight, the colored slips on your paper are the place to write them down. We'll be collecting those after the speakers speak. And the members of the board will circulate it through the room, pick up those, and we'll read and we'll hand the questions to the speakers. And at the moment, I'd like our board members to rise and be recognized. Thanks. Thanks. Okay. Okay. Thank you much. And Mike and Roger, it's all yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Russ, and thanks to all of you for coming and joining us this evening. The largest projects in any jurisdiction's capital budget are usually its major transportation projects. That's not surprising when you stop and think about it. Transportation infrastructure is both labor and capital intensive and often requires many years to complete. The all-time champion in our neighborhood was the Woodrow Wilson Bridge project, which topped out at over $2.5 billion. Fortunately, the lion's share of that was federal and state money, and there is nothing else on Alexandria's horizon approaching that magnitude. But the Potomac Yard Metro Station is on our horizon, and it is a very big deal for Alexandria. On one side of the ledger, depending on the site selected for the station, its estimated capital cost could run from under $200 million to more than $500 million, making it the single largest and most costly capital improvement project in the city's history. On the other side of the ledger, net new tax revenue to the city from new development attracted by the station could amount to tens of millions of dollars over the next 20 years and beyond, as much as $50 or $60 million a year by the out years, which could pay for a lot of city services. Each of our panelists this evening brings especially strong experience and a unique perspective to this question. Deputy City Manager Mark Jinks was previously Alexandria's Chief Financial Officer for 10 years, and prior to that was Director of Management and Finance for Arlington County. He is, by my estimation, not his, Alexandria's go-to guy on the financing of complex projects such as this. Paul Hertel is an economist by profession and is an experienced citizen volunteer analyst of transportation policies and plans in Alexandria, and probably the city's foremost advocate for the integrity of the George Washington Memorial Parkway. Former Mayor Kerry Donnelly has been a leading advocate for the positive impact of robust economic development throughout his career of public service in Alexandria, currently as a member of the Potomac Yard Metrorail Implementation Work Group. And finally, former City Councilman Frank Fannin, a lifelong Alexandrian and a mortgage banker in private life, emphasized budget and finance issues during his term on the council, pointing to the magnitude and implications of the cost of the Potomac Yard Metrorail station project, among others. Those are our panelists. I will ask them if they would come forward to our head table, and we will begin with Deputy Manager Jinks.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be back here again. I think it was probably about a year ago when we talked about Potomac Yard Metro Station planning, and bring you up to speed on where things have been in the last year. And unlike some of you had watched Channel 4 earlier, I think it was last week, it said the station was up in the air. The station, basically the environmental impact statement process that I'm going to describe, basically keeps things up in the air, so you can look at basically feasible alternatives, weigh the pros and cons of them, and then choose the appropriate alternative. The metro station in Potomac Yard is intended to basically provide the needs of current residents and future residents of Potomac Yard, of the immediate neighborhoods. It is intended to provide an infill station in a regional system, connect that portion of Alexandria to the rest of the region, and it's vitally important that we be connected to the rest of the region, particularly for jobs, so people can get to their jobs, or we can draw jobs into Potomac Yard by the construction of office space. To show you how important a metro station is, right now in the Washington area, 84% of all office building construction now underway in the Washington area is within a quarter mile of a metro station. Basically, they're not building it anywhere else except there. And so if the city is to grow jobs in a significant manner, the Metrorail station really represents an economic development opportunity. In addition, as Mike indicated, it's not just to get jobs and to pay for the station, but there's a chart later on that you'll see where basically the return on investment for the Metrorail station is substantial in the eventual increase in tax revenues that will help the city. And help the city's general fund. One of the key things is City Council right now, right this very moment, is determining the final kind of marking up the budget so they can adopt it on Thursday night. And one of the issues is that how is our tax base growing? How much of our tax base is commercial versus residential? And in recent years, over the last decade, it has slid and is far more residential than it was commercial, and that means the burden of paying for the government falls more on homeowners and renters than it does on commercial businesses. And if we're going to reverse that, it's going to take the kind of development that, in effect, requires few city services like commercial development that pays net new monies into the general fund. The key issues with Potomac Yard are laid out here. I'll talk a little later. We have FAA height limitations that really drive, in a sense, the options related to where the station's located. Clearly, as Mike mentioned earlier, the impact on the GW Parkway, having a funding plan that is feasible. Right now, this is the development plan for Potomac Yard. With the North Potomac Yard, the retail center where the red and purple buildings are, and then further on south is the area you now see largely under construction have been the townhouses on the lower left-hand side. The station alternatives, you can faintly see those adjacent to Potomac Greens, are the lower level rows of townhouses, and alternative A is next to that, and B's further north, and then D is further north of that. And you could see the development pattern in this plan, North Potomac Yard, really puts the density in the taller buildings in the northern part of the yard, and that has to do with the flight path over one of the runways of National Airport crosses the yard, and the FAA rules say basically the buildings under that flight path have to be lower. It's not an actively used runway in a sense of planes coming in every hour, every couple hours. Rather, it is a short runway that it is largely used for emergency landings. But the airport's authority, although they don't use it much, has stated, as you could understand, they want to keep their airways clear. So that has really driven the development pattern of Potomac Yard. The development activity so far, the darker areas are the ones that have been completed. The kind of salmon colored is what's under construction, and you have a giant and residential under construction near where the city's fire station is, and then other multifamily and single family under construction towards the Monroe Avenue Bridge, and then below that you have multifamily and rows of townhouses and stacked townhouses being built. So the development activity has exceeded the early projections for Potomac Yard in a sense of the rate of development, and the prices have exceeded prior projections in a sense of both rent and projected rent and also sales prices. North Potomac Yard is under a single ownership. It's 70 acres. It was built as a temporary use. The idea was we're just going to scrape this after 15 years and be done with it. Well, the sales per square foot here have been far exceeded expectations. The Target store is one of the best performing Target stores in the nation and the best one in the East Coast. So they're going to end up staying longer than originally had been projected. The first part of development here is likely to be the movie theater site where the lease is up there at the end of 2018. And you could see in the right-hand side here is a 3D projection of what North Potomac Yard would look like based upon the 2010 plan. Here's an idea of the FAA height limitations. which is one of the benefits of a station alternative B is it gets really closer to where you can have higher buildings, whereas the alternative A is really more underneath the where the lower heights are, and that's important in regards to the pros and cons of each of the stations. Because of the potential impact on the GW Parkway and because of the potential outside possibility of federal grants and clear possibility of federal loans to help in this process, there's an environmental impact statement process that's been ongoing for about the last 2 years. You can see that we're at the point of a draft environmental impact statement down at the kind of bottom middle of the slide. The current schedule has a draft and environmental impact statement being completed in the fall, public hearings, council choosing what's called a locally preferred alternative, i.e. deciding whether to build a station, and if so, what site. They would do that in January of 2015, and then it goes through a process of basically a final decision and final decision document by the Federal Transit Administration. This has been an interesting process, and I've kidded before, this is not unlike the characters of Downton Abbey, that they're all characters, they all have their points of view, they all have clearly are sticking out for their interests and articulating those, and so this has been an interesting group to kind of get to work together and to try to resolve and deal with the particular problems. We've got the environmental impact statement process is managed by Metro. They're their tracks, it's their station, they're going to build it. The National Park Service is involved because of their potential interest in issues related to station alternatives. The city is paying for this along with some federal and regional money. And ultimately, sitting at kind of the head of the table is the Federal Transit Administration, because this is a transit project. They are the lead, and they are the essential coordinators. Although a lot of the coordination we're really having to do as the city to try to get all these separate interests to work in concert. All the station alternatives have an impact. One way or the other, whether it's noise, they would all clearly have a construction impact. The various alternative A and B have different impacts on Potomac Greens Park. There is a 1999 scenic easement that alternative B impacts, and this is an easement that was put in place by the National Park Service, largely in the owner of Potomac Yard at the time. It allowed several million square feet of development to be moved to where there had been a scenic easement in Arlington, and those are the high-rise buildings you can see by 4 Mile Run, which created open space in North Arlington. It also resolved a long-standing city issue, which was making sure there wasn't access from what's now Potomac Greens onto the GW Parkway with a road access. But that in effect is one of the issues we have to deal with. There are some wetlands in the parkway. Two of the alternatives would require some National Park Service owned land. There's a concern on how it would look from the parkway. And one of the issues, in order to resolve this visual impact issue, in May we will have a physical model completed so everybody can look physically and walk around a very large table with a three-dimensional model of Potomac Yard constructed. And we're also doing what they call a visualization study, which basically means animated 3D, as if you're driving on the parkway, both in winter when the leaves are off the trees and in summer. Say, what would you see for all of the various alternatives, so that we can get out of hopefully a lot of conjecture of what people think they may see and get actually into what the people do computer engineering say, based on your designs, this is what you actually would end up looking at. And the progress to date started out, and as an EIS, you start out looking at everything and narrow it down. We started out with 36 alternatives, got it down to 4, which is no build, and the 3 alternatives that are on the handout on your tables. the pros and cons of all the alternatives, and that's what the draft EIS is sorting through at the current point in time. The current alternatives are laid out here. I won't go into that since you all have that in front of you. The one of the B alternative, we've blown this one up, and I think you also have that as a handout. And this has this is the one that has the most impact on the GW Parkway, and it straightens out the metro track so that it goes on National Park Service property a little bit just north of that, where that yellow bar takes a dip downward, and then the scenic easement, which is actually on city property, was on developer property, then subsequently granted to the city as part of building, as a park, as part of building Potomac Greens, and you could see the station impact there. So those are two of the key issues. In regards to the National Park Service property, one mitigation alternative that's being looked at is basically not straightening the track, but leaving some curve in it, and would require Metro. They're looking at it right now, changing the design speed, maximum speed that it's designed for, so that the track can remain a bit more curved and stay off of Park Service property. So that's one of those things that's being looked at. The construction access largely has been addressed. The initial discussion was having construction access off the GW Parkway, and that's been reviewed and determined that for all the alternatives, the construction can be done. So it's none of them have to be done from the GW Parkway. It means more from Potomac Greens. It means maybe craning over the railroad tracks, but the issue of access from the Parkway is basically, I think, for construction purposes, is moot. One of the things the National Park Service asked us to look at in order to mitigate the largely the scenic easement issue was moving the CSX tracks towards the movie theater site. In fact, it would put it on the movie theater site and require its demolition. The city said we would look at this alternative, and that has been a lot of the work of the last year. First, we had to determine whether it was technically feasible. The answer is yes, it is technically feasible. We hired some railroad engineers, and they determined that. And the other issue was, would this be a benefit to CSX? The CSX doesn't have to cooperate with us. And in regards to, the engineer said, yes, it straightens the track out a little bit from where it is now, and railroads like straighter track rather than curved track, so it does benefit from them. The challenge is, and this is dealing with CSX, is the time it takes to get things done. We called them in August to set up a meeting. It took them to November to meet with us so they could get everybody together. They then went back from our meeting to basically talk with their senior leadership in regards to whether they wanted to proceed to have further discussions with us. We're still waiting for them to decide whether they want to decide to discuss with us further. The other chief challenge with this option is the movie theater lease goes to the end of 2018, so you can't get on this site to start the CSX moving the CSX tracks, building new tracks, and then they move over, and then you get to build the station until January 1, 2019. So this alternative would take 3 years longer to complete, which means it adds to construction inflation and obviously delays when the metro station might open in Potomac Yard. The various alternatives are laid out in alternative A is the least cost alternative at $209 million. B is $268. The CSX option is $83 million. It's cost basically to move the tracks and pay for the movie theaters. A large part of the movie theater site is $83 million more, total $351 million. An alternative D is an aerial version that when we all looked at it, we said, we don't want to do this. It's $500 million. It would look like Tyson's Corners. And I don't know of a single advocate for it in the entire community. Plus, the last time we did a financial analysis, it was way out of the ballpark as far as being affordable. So the real issues, I think, are, and the real debate's going to focus on A or B. And how we pay for it. The whole idea when we entered the Potomac Yard planning process was getting the station to be self-financing from sources generated within Potomac Yard. In 2010, the study said that could be done. It'd be done by using net new tax revenue generated from new development in Potomac Yard, and it's net new, so we're setting aside some amount of dollars to pay for city services, and these are only the dollars not needed for that. It's primarily real estate taxes, and we're not relying on income taxes or sales taxes. With real estate taxes, we've got a stable and reliable source of income, and that doesn't vary a whole lot. I was looking at a chart, the last 37 years, real estate in Northern Virginia, the average price of a house increased 33 of those 37 years. In the last 10 years in the city, 8 of those last 10 years, the average values had increased. We're also using very conservative growth assumptions here. We're not assuming a 4 or 5% annual appreciation in real estate. We're assuming inflation or like 1 point above inflation. You know, real estate, if you have an investment portfolio, you know it's basically is not something that appreciates in time over like the stock market. It basically is something that's considered a pretty dull, stable, conservative investment, and that is what our real estate. That is what our revenue projections or Potomac Yard are based on. It would be financed because you got to build all the station at once by issuing city bonds or going to the federal government and getting a loan. Since we did the initial study, the regional transportation, we did it based saying, could we go solo? And the answer was yes. We knew we weren't planning on going solo for sure. If we could get out somebody else's money, federal money, or if the state came up, finally solved its transportation problem, or at least began to address it with new revenues, then we would seek those. And we have on our CIP $66 million in region. NVTA stands for the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and seeking a substantial amount of funds for the Potomac Yard Metro Station. And we will be seeking additional state assistance as well to put the whole funding package together. Finally, on the funding, the funding piece, we briefed the bond rating agencies before we went to the Planning Commission in 2010 and City Council with a proposed plan, and the rating agency basically gave us a thumbs up, realizing that Metrorail stations in the Washington area have been home runs as far as economic development is concerned. One of the better things you can, if placed rightly, done right, can produce tremendous amounts of return. Arlington County, for example, they bought 2 more metro stations than they were supposed to get back when the system was built. And that's why you stop so many times between Roslyn and Ballston. And that basically put more opportunity within a quarter mile, half mile of a metro station, and their tax base and tax rates benefited as a result. The financing chart, this shows the revenue growth, is the bar charts that go off to the right, that produce by 2043, 30 years out, $50 million really net new dollars to the general fund. The dark line, beige line that runs through it, that's the debt service line. And so you could see, like a lot of revenue projects, the first few years things are rather tight, but after about 7 or 8 years, then the general fund begins to get what turns out to be a substantial amount of dollars. There are developer contributions for Alternative B, but there's a small amount of developer contributions for A, but the big ones are for B, because the developer closest to B was willing to put up money to have that station closer to them. For A, they said they didn't see the benefit because it was too far away. Our next steps, I said we should have hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we'll have the models. We'll announce where they are and how you can see them. We're going to have a Pine Magus Potomac Yard Implementation Advisory Group. They're meeting on May 15th, and we plan to have the models ready for public review before the meeting and after the meeting. We get to the fall, and there would be public hearings related to the release of the draft environmental impact statement, and lots of education and input to City Council, who then would choose a locally preferred alternative, which could be any one of the 3B alternatives, any one of those alternatives mitigated in some way and changed in order to deal with some of the downside negative elements, or council could choose a no-build alternative as the preferred alternative. So that is it is open for public hearing and decision in January, and then it goes through the rest of this federal process, where the final decision and sign off by the Federal Transit Administration, what they call a recorded decision, would be in the fall of 2015. And then somewhere after the locally preferred alternative, Metro then would start a process of selecting a design builder to start the design build process. So by the time we get to a recorded decision, things are going forward so that the Metro station could get underway, and it takes about 2 years to construct. So that in a nutshell is the overview of the Metro station. There is I think it's the last slide. There is the URL. It's the city's website's /Potomac Yard. There's a lot more information and copies of all the reports that we have done from day one for anybody to look at it. And as always, we're available in the office to answer questions. And Rich Baer tonight, our Director of Environmental Services, is here, and he can help as well. Thanks.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the board of the Agenda Alexandria for inviting me here, and for you for coming out this evening. Before I start, I think it's important to put the George Washington Memorial Parkway in some context. The whole notion of the George Washington Memorial Parkway was an idea that was very important to the young nation. As a matter of fact, they referred to it as everyone who visited Washington, every patriot who visited Washington, had a duty to make the pious pilgrimage to the Mount Vernon to visit George Washington's home. Unfortunately, the road that was there was mostly dilapidated wooded trails, so that did not go down so well. The road did not follow the Potomac River, but rather the current Route 1 alignment and veered east towards Mount Vernon at Gum Springs. Carolyn Gilman described it in The Poetry of Traveling as being intolerably bad, and no one probably passes it without thinking before he arrives at Mount Vernon that he has paid too dear for his whistle. Alexandria fared no better, because fortune had passed it by. The city was described as a quaint, old, sleepy, dilapidated little town where no one wishes to linger. But one did have to pass through it. In 1887, Edward Fox came up with the idea to create the National Highway from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon in an article he wrote in the National Republican. Fox called for the making of a splendid drive, a grand avenue and 100 feet wide that was properly graded and shaded between the capital city and the nation and the tomb of its great founder. Mayor John B. Smoot picked up on this, and in 1888, he founded the Mount Vernon Avenue Association here in Alexandria to promulgate the idea of creating a national road to George Washington's home. It would travel through Alexandria on the basis that we had here many of the establishments that were there when George Washington walked these streets, primarily because fortune had passed Alexandria by, so the buildings were still there. This, as you see, is from 1899, a float that the Mount Vernon Association took in the sesquicentennial parade. The organization appealed to Congress, who then really got started in 1889 with trying to design this. They appropriated money for Colonel Haynes to come up with 3 routes, one of which came through Alexandria. But Congress allocated no money. And here are the routes that he came up with, as you can see. And a closer look here, one goes through Old Town at the bottom, and the other one goes roughly by Telegraph Road, and the third up there by Quaker Lane. Parallel to this, in 1898, the centennial of the nation's capital was impending, and a group of citizens approached President McKinley about a plan for celebrating the event. This eventually resulted in the creation of the Macmillan Senate Park Committee in 1901-02, one of the most important committees in the nation's history. Park enthusiasts, historians, and planners in Washington, D.C. often invoke the great and expansive vision of the Macmillan Plan as the conceptual underpinning of today's National Mall and Washington's D.C.'s park system. Although they were not dealing with it, the Macmillan Committee took time out and very specifically addressed the need and importance of having a road leading to the home of the Father of the Union. The committee had clearly been influenced by landscape architect pioneers Olmsted, Vogue, Cleveland, and Elliott, who were credited with creating the term parkway. Because the committee envisioned that, quote, these drives had certain definitions. Parkways are ways through or between parks, distinguished from highways or ordinary streets by the dominant purpose of recreation rather than movement, restricted to pleasure vehicles and arranged with regard for scenery, topography, and similar feature rather than for directness. This is a picture of 1930. That was the old road. And although World War I had taken its toll, interest in history, particularly colonial and early American history, remained strong. This was accentuated by George Washington's bicentennial, which was coming up. So in 1924, a committee was formed by Congress, and in 1932, the road was constructed. And it traveled through Alexandria on what we call Washington Street. In doing so, the city of Alexandria entered into the 1929 agreement with the federal government, promising to keep the memorial character of the parkway. These are kind of some of the main features. Although there are some other features in the 1929 agreement that a lot of people are not aware of. But anyway, we'll keep the dignity and purpose, and we'll do nothing to contravene it. Those are the main tenets of it. Alexandria being Alexandria, we kind of fell off the wagon. And in 1946, the federal government said, you people are hopeless. And we are moving the parkway literally. This was the plan. It was to circumvent Alexandria in its entirety and run through the waterfront, just bypassing Alexandria. And we said, wait, if we create this historic district to protect the parkway, then will you allow us to keep it? That is what happened, and is why Alexandria created the historic district. Obviously, over the years, there have been numerous battles back and forth, and so in 1999, Mayor Kerry Donnelly, at the time, asked the Park Services to write, what do you think is the memorial character of the parkway? Many of the features in their response got translated into the Washington Street Standards Ordinance as we know it today. The George Washington Memorial Parkway is not a neglected stepchild, but rather the genesis of the entire historic district. And by inference, it is responsible for our place on the tourist maps. It inculcates a heritage that warrants sharing with the world as it makes its pilgrimage from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon to pay respect to the father of this country. The Parkway also represents a trust placed on the city by the federal government that we would maintain the highway for the purpose and dignity it was created, or that it was envisioned to convey. Anyway, so I'm just going to limit it to option A and B, because really option D is not going to happen. And more than likely the CSX option's not going to happen either. But anyway, option A. So how does this affect the Parkway? Well, as it was presented originally, as you can see, the blue is the wetlands, the tan is the affected area, and that's option A. Now, in a meeting I attended, I suggested that I had issues with option B, and they said, well, you know, we can also use the Parkway for option A. And so, and here's option B. Interestingly enough, this one was where the city thought that it was okay to put a right-in, right-out on the Parkway and use the Parkway as a truck route. As a matter of fact, Frank Fannin and I attended a meeting in which the city staff articulated, but that didn't really matter because it was a parkway. To which the WMATA representative said, I think that's the point they're making. If you look here, and I think it's kind of a misnomer to say A and B have different effects on the proposal for the wetlands and stuff like that, because they are interchangeable on that. And I think this one probably, as Mark pointed out, this has probably gone away. The use of the right-in, right-out, the use of the Parkway, and some of the more damaging features on the wetlands. I do not know, but I presume that's gone away. But here, the green is the scenic easement. And option B proposes to build a metro. Not only do they want to, one of the reasons they want option B was put on the table was it allowed the construction of the metro without interfering with operations. So thereby they shift everything closer to the Parkway. They build a new track and build a metro station around it. And that's why it's much closer to the Parkway. Unfortunately, it is in the scenic easement. And unfortunately, also it envisioned that the new track would run through the Park Service land. I'm quoting Congressman Moran here. It is against federal law. It is against federal law. And yet it was still on the table. So, from this perspective, and if you look over in, how do I go back? Just go back one, two, option, yeah, there. One of the features of this is, you see that bridge that crosses over there from Potomac Yard onto the metro station? It's going to be as tall as Monroe Avenue Bridge.
Which one? Far left one, the middle one? That one?
They're both. Both. You see, Monroe Avenue Bridge is the minimum height, or thereabouts. So they have to be of that height. And the problem is the proximity to the Georgia Washington Memorial Parkway, so it's clearly going to be visible. The other thing is the scenic easement. Why was the scenic easement granted? Back in 1999, Rick Gilchrist, who was chairman of Commonwealth Atlantic Properties, was very much encouraged to come to the city of Alexandria to build to put the patent trademark office on Potomac Yard. Unfortunately, when he got here, he found out that there really wasn't popular support for it. And at that time, a committee was set up and headed by Jim Dunning, former sheriff, and which negotiated with Rick Gilchrist. And one of the things that came out of that was for Rick Gilchrist, because that property was previously owned by Commonwealth Atlantic Properties and it was handed over to the city. And one of the deals that was entered into was that they would put in an easement precluding the right in, right out. But also in that was the notion that the tranquil scenery that you see, and that every one of my friends that comes to this town mentioned and talks about how beautiful it is, would be kept in perpetuity. And so let me just end by quote here. This is from Jerry L. Krakow. He wrote it in 1967. The line must be held, or their physical character and setting will be lost forever, leaving nothing to remind us or future generations of our past. We will be measured by our legacy. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to quickly sort of lay out my rationale why I think the metro station at Potomac Yard is vitally important, and that we should complete the EIS as soon as possible. I would actually argue that the environmental impact process to date has dragged on long enough. We should expedite its completion. Presently, the city's schedule has it 2 years behind its originally anticipated schedule. Potomac Yard is, I think, an opportunity for us to employ the smart growth philosophies that I think have been important to the city, and certainly we see them in play at Carlisle right now. You know, smart growth is essentially, and Potomac Yards is the right place to put this kind of density because the transportation infrastructure is largely in place. We have Route 1, new Potomac Avenue, a street grid that will accommodate a lot of the traffic, a new bus rapid transit service that's going to start later this year, an existing Metrorail line, and now we need a Metrorail station. And development at Potomac Yard is the right place for smart, supportable, and sustainable growth, as opposed to the BRAC facility, which we all know too well, in the city's west end, which was thrust upon us, and it lacked all of the mass transit infrastructure that we need to support smart and positive growth. And quite frankly, it's off the tax base, not what we're talking about here. Regionally, developing at Potomac Yard makes a lot of sense as well. The growth is going to come one way or another to the metropolitan area, and I think it's a lot wiser to put it inside the Beltway rather than in outlying areas, which only is going to contribute to sprawl and regional congestion. It's also absolutely vital that Alexandria use Potomac Yard to expand its tax base. I would argue that it's not whether we can afford to do it. We cannot afford not to do a metro station at Potomac Yard. Essentially, right now in the city's finances, there's a 2% deficit that we face every year. And that's because our revenue base has not been growing to support our expenses. This year, for example, general fund revenues are increasing at about 1.6%. That's our general fund revenue, largely real property taxes. Yet expenses, before any real reductions, they're growing at about 3.5%. So there's a 2% difference right from the get-go. And I think this imbalance that we have between revenues and expenditures is actually structural in nature, because our revenue base is in fact not growing. I think it's actually 7 out of the last 8 years where our expenses without doing anything, are increasing faster than our revenues. And that's the structural problem that we have to address, and we can only address that through expansion of our tax base. The Mayor's Economic Sustainability Task Force, which was convened many years ago, recommended, and the council endorsed, that we should strive to have a balance between commercial development, commercial tax base, and residential tax base, and that we should try to achieve a 50-50 split between commercial and residential development. But in fact, since that time, we've actually moved in the opposite direction. This year, commercial property versus residential property, well, residential property of our tax base will represent 56.6% of our real property tax base, while commercial will represent 43.4% of our real property tax base. And that's actually overstating the value of commercial property, because under Virginia law, multifamily residential development is considered commercial development, commercial property. So if you pull out the multifamily residential, our commercial property tax base actually is much lower. Our residential tax base would be 74.1% as opposed to 25.9% on the commercial side. And so we're actually losing our commercial tax base, whereas the Mayor's Economic Sustainability Task Force many years ago recommended a 50-50 balance. I think it's also important that we look to expand our commercial tax base, because it exponentially provides more value to the properties, and it doesn't carry the concomitant demand for additional services. For example, residential development yields a need for schools, parks, libraries, recreation centers. Commercial development, on the other hand, does not carry those kinds of demands for services. So as we add more residential development, we are also requiring more in the way of services to accommodate that very same development. Additional revenue from commercial development can be used to fund essential public services, police, fire, public education, emergency medical, or it can be used to reduce the tax burden and provide tax relief, and those decisions are obviously made by our city council. The single biggest thing we could do as a matter of policy would be to approve the metro station and get it going. As Mark mentioned in his comments, and he's absolutely right, you know, almost all the commercial development that we're seeing in the Washington region is at or near metro stations. From a regional perspective, I think we need to use the metro station to our competitive advantage. Further delay, I think, puts us at a disadvantage. My understanding is that right now there are 31 million square feet of federally leased space that's coming due in the next 3 or 4 years. Without a metro station, we can't even bid or even put forward a proposal at Potomac Yard for any of that federal lease space. It's a tremendous lost opportunity. You know, if those leases go someplace else, it's gone, and we're not going to be able to find them at Potomac Yard. Tremendous. It's a tremendous lost opportunity. Not to mention any of the private sector alternatives that are also looking to locate at or near metro stations. And the competition is only going to get stiffer with the opening of the Silver Line, which opens up the entire western corridor of Fairfax County for federal leases. So the competition is going to be greater. Opportunities are there now, and we're missing those opportunities by dragging on this process much further. Again, we're 2 years behind schedule already. You know, we need to use the attributes of Alexandria to our competitive advantage. Proximity to Washington, our nearby national airport, our existing transportation network, and these are the things that are the successful attributes that will attract commercial tenants or federal users, and the Potomac Yard Metro Station is absolutely essential in that whole equation. Mark touched on the financing as well. And the financing in the new station is actually better today with the low interest rate environment and the new Northern Virginia transportation funding. When we originally approved the Potomac Yard zoning, we anticipated, we projected that we would have to carry a $250 million debt burden to finance the station. Now that's projected, at least with candidate B, the candidate B alternative, to be $268 million. And we also projected that it would be financed with debt through bonds. The bonds would be paid by the special taxing district and the net new revenues as Mark outlined. Now, if we turn our attention to and our efforts to, let's say, candidate build A, the cost right now is estimated to be $209 million. Together with the $66 million from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, the borrowing, instead of $250 million, can be financed for $143 million. Actually, $118 million if we're approved for a Tiger grant funding of $25 million, as Mark's chart pointed out, which is much less than we projected, resulting in lower carrying costs, lower interest costs, and reduced burden on the taxpayers, primarily at Potomac Yard, since the special tax district will pay for those bonds. I don't think, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think we can afford any delay, any more delay in the EIS process. The recent schedule put out by the city puts the Metro Station two years behind its original schedule. We've been examining 4 candidate build alternatives, if you want to count the CSX alternative as a candidate build alternative, as well as a no-build alternative. And in my opinion, further examination will not yield any more results. 3 of the candidate build alternatives either have environmental or design flaws, or they're flatly unaffordable. You know, I've been saying for months that the city needs to complete its portion of the EIS process by June, release it for public comment and consideration over the summer with the goal of holding hearings in September and the selection of a locally preferred alternative. But the sooner we finish our process, the sooner that process can then move on to WMATA and the federal process. We need to expedite what we can control, because we're not going to be able to control it once it gets to WMATA and to the federal Federal Transit Authority. I want to read a quote, and this really, in my estimation, puts forward the case for commercial development and public finance. And this comes from the city's fiscal year 15 forecast of its budget. With long-term forecast growth in the city's expenditures of 4.2%, which is not very robust. That's long-term growth of 4.2%, including capital and operating impacts. Annual revenues must grow by at least that amount in order to bring our budget into balance. That points to the structural imbalance and the need to grow our tax base. And commercial development is going to enable us to achieve that growth without dramatically increasing demand for public services. And those public services are schools, libraries, parks, recreation centers. Now, I played a large role in attracting the Patent and Trademark Office to Alexandria. And I feel strongly about that accomplishment because it will help pay for the essential services that we need and we deserve: education, fire, police, emergency medical. And likewise, I played a large role in the attraction of the National Science Foundation to Alexandria, and for those same reasons. Now, let me just leave you with a couple of facts and figures that I think sort of drives home this point. In fiscal year 14, the real estate taxes alone at the Patent and Trademark Office are approximately $9.5 million. And this does not include real estate taxes from associated development. It doesn't include sales tax revenue or hotel occupancy revenue. Just the real estate taxes on the 5 buildings alone at Potomac Yard, $9.5 million. Now, I dare say that the Patent and Trademark Office does not consume $9.5 million worth of public services each and every year. Coincidentally, in 2005, our real estate tax rate fell from 91.5 cents to 81.5 cents, and that was the same year that we felt the full impact, the full benefit of the Patent and Trademark Office here in Alexandria. That's the kind of revenue that it generates. That's the kind of dollars that we need to address the structural imbalance of essentially a 2% annual deficit. And we can cut our budget each and every year, but until we address the structural issue of the lack of commercial development in Alexandria, we're going to have to cut more and more and more every year. Now, I was kidding Mark at dinner tonight because he decided to come here rather than go to the last add-delete session associated with the budget. He said it was a real tough choice. Come here to Agenda Alexandria or go listen to the city council fight about the budget. I'm going to come here to Agenda Alexandria. But what we're facing in this year's budget, let's think about some of those issues, for example. You know, as I mentioned, 7 out of the last 8 years, we've had a situation where our expenses have exceeded our revenues. And this year we've had to, and we've cut each one of those 7 out of those 8 years. But this year, we're talking about some essential public services. We're talking about closing down a fire station. We're talking about ending the elderly tax relief. And we're also talking about, you know, not being able to fund our public schools the way our school board wants us to. That's the kind of decisions that are being made because we lack the revenue to afford the services that, quite frankly, we need and we deserve. And we can achieve that by addressing the structural imbalance in our revenue base. And the single biggest thing we can do right now is approve the Metro station at Potomac Yard. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's been a pleasure to be a sponsor of this program for the past few years, and I'd like to thank the current board members for asking me to be on the board here next year. So I look forward to participating in more of these wonderful discussions. I'm a numbers person, so please indulge me. I'll throw some numbers at you. I'm the fourth speaker here tonight. I haven't seen any closed eyes yet, and I want to try to keep that going here. So as we move forward and talk about Potomac Yards, the question is, at what cost to city taxpayers will it take to make Potomac Yards successful, and is that feasible without a metro station? When I was on the city council, I voted for Potomac Yards, and all of us want the project to be successful to the homeowners, the businesses, and the city itself. And this is what the community and the elected officials are going to be speaking about over the next 9 months to a year, and it's going to be one of the biggest decisions our city has ever made. When we look at economic decisions and decisions that we make in the city, what I like to do when I was on the city council is really take a look at how does this affect the everyday Alexandrian. We're the engaged crowd. There's only about 15% of the people that live in the community that are actually engaged in what happens here. 140,000 people live in Alexandria. That's enough to fill National Stadium. And the majority of Alexandrians care about 3 real things. When it snows, are your roads clear? When you have a problem or crime, are the police there for you? And when you're sick, you want the ambulance there within 5 minutes. Those are what the everyday Alexandrian cares about, is the way I look at it. And as Mr. Hobbs talked about earlier, we really need to take a look at the capital costs that we put out there. When we spent $110 million for T.C. Williams, it's a beautiful school. It's the largest high school in Virginia, but it was also the most expensive high school in America when we built it. We spent $80 million on the police station. Once again, a state-of-the-art project, but one of the most expensive police stations that has been built. And we haven't even started talking about the approximate $500 million, or who knows what the number will be, when we need to redo the sewers over the next 10 to 20 years here in the city. Approximately 43% of the people that live in the city are homeowners, and we carry the bulk of the tax burden in the city. Right now, we operate on about a $600 million city budget, And of that, $60 million goes to the debt service. It's basically simple math. If you have a $100,000 mortgage, your payment's going to be less than $1 million mortgage. And it's the same with these capital projects, except there's just a lot more zeros on the end of it. And that's what we need to question is, will we be getting the return for these projects? So in Potomac Yards, we need to take a look at what we already have there right now. If you look at the parcel of land, when a lot of metro stations are built, when they built Crystal City, they paid the extra money to underground it. When you look at King Street and Braddock Road, people can approach this metro station from the north, south, east, and west, okay? Where we are in Potomac Yards right now, you're never going to develop to the east because obviously the parkway and the river is there. It's built out to the north where Crystal City is. To the south, it's built out at Braddock Road. So really, if we do this metro station, the real development will just be to the west side of the metro station. As I mentioned, the Arlington paid the extra money to underground the stations. And when we go to, if the city council goes to vote on this station, it's going to be a very, very important decision and very difficult, the way I see it. But cooperation with the other agencies is what's very important. As Paul mentioned earlier, the National Park Service, they're one of the largest federal agencies out there, and you can't really do much with the situation there in the environmental studies. And when we talk about the railroad, the reality here is CSX isn't going to move the railroad tracks. I mean, they're one of the most powerful businesses in our country, and the city found out the hard way back in 2008 when they tried to sue Norfolk Southern with the situation with the ethanol out there. You have the federal preemption laws, which basically say if these railroads are engaged in interstate commerce, there's no state or local municipality that can regulate them. So we didn't make any friends with the railroads when that lawsuit went on, and it was one that we knew we were going to lose, but the suit still went forward. And basically, right now, CSX really doesn't have an interest in moving their tracks. So if we build it, as pretty much the whole panel here agrees, option A is going to end up being the option. And finally, some of our elected leaders, a couple of the councilmen at the meeting last Tuesday, they finally came around, and one of our councilmen publicly expressed that the reality is if we're going to build it, it's going to be option A. And then another councilman said, well, really, do we need to build it, option A, it's mostly going to be for residential development? Because obviously the developers would like to have the option B site, which is closer to their properties, and they were going to put more money into it. So if we build it at option A, we're really going to be close to the residential properties. You know, affordable housing is always a challenge, and the more debt that we take on, the taxes rise. I recently went up to New York City. I was on a train ride. I was with some council members from New Bedford, Connecticut, very similar city to ours. They were leaving the League of Cities conference, and we had a great conversation for about an hour or so. And you know, we're fortunate in Virginia here. We are a low-tax state. Basically, our local real estate taxes are 1% of the home value right now. $700,000 house, about $7,000 a year. But in Connecticut, these folks are paying about 2.25% of the home value. And that's one of my main concerns, that the more we take on this debt, look, we all want the economic value to come here, but by spending $250 million or whatever the number is, are we really going to get that return in Potomac Yards? I definitely hope so. For those of you that were reading the papers a few weeks ago, there was a special election over in Arlington County, and the local political establishment, they were endorsing the candidate who wanted to spend $360 million on a streetcar and $80 million for an aquatics facility. Well, that candidate ended up losing the election. It was a low turnout election. It was community voters, people that are engaged in the topic over there, and it was a 57-41 vote. So basically, the people came out, and in Arlington County, they said no to $80 million swimming pools, $360 million streetcars. And Arlington has a tough decision now. They have a county board over there with only 5 members compared to the 7 we have in Alexandria, and they're 3-2 for the streetcar right now. Last year our city council had the largest tax increase in living memory of 4 cents, and very likely they're in the budget meetings right now, and I think there'll be another tax increase that'll be passed on next week. And my concern is I just don't want to price the citizens out of Alexandria. And in closing, demand for office space is decreased over time. Basically, technology has improved a lot of the needs for the office space. The federal government shed 800,000 square feet of office space over the past few years. As Mr. Donnelly mentioned, a lot of these leases are coming up, and if we have the building in Potomac Yard, yes, they could come there, but there is a tremendous amount of regional competition when you look at the Silver Line out in Fairfax County, and that's arguably an easier location for most of the workforce to get to. If you're coming from Prince William County or Loudoun County or DC or Arlington, Tyson's Corner is a better, easier location to get to than we are here in Alexandria. So, and as many of you know, when you leave here tonight, if you take a left and drive down Eisenhower Avenue, you'll see a big vacant building that's been sitting there for 7 years. So it's not that easy to lease these commercial buildings. Believe me, we all wish it was leased, and that's where the Brack Ship building should have been, but it didn't turn out that way. Just like all of you, I want what's best for Alexandria, but we need to weigh all these options up and down before we make a final decision. So the question, the $250 million question is, if we build it, will they come? That's what we'll find out over the next year. Thank you so much.
Our Confederates on the board wearing badges with red borders will circulate among you to pick up your questions. Please make them legible. Obviously, if we can't read them, we won't. And the colored slips of paper are there for your writing questions. In the meantime, I understand from Alan that we have a couple of door prizes that we can award to our guests this evening while the board members are collecting the questions, and then we'll begin the question.
We do. If I could, let me get where I can be heard. Do we have a board member back there that has the bowl with the cards in it? Okay, while the cards are making their way up here, we could have a little bit of a commercial. Of course, you come here one Monday night a month, but what do you do with the rest of your Monday nights? Well, these days at Sweet Fire Donna's on John Carlisle Street, Mondays are Manic Mondays with half-priced ribs, and Mango Mike Anderson, who operates Sweet Fire Donna's, has donated a couple of door prizes for us tonight. So we have two $25 gift certificates for Sweet Fire Donna's. And let's shuffle these a little bit. And Mark, would you pick a winner? Oh, our winner appears to be alternative B. Carolyn and Bill Doving. Come on up and collect your ribs. And Paul, how about if you pick our second winner? Mark Robb. There you go. And gentlemen, the mic's yours again.
Good evening. Well, you've all heard many perspectives on this whole issue, and what we're going to do now is sort of open up the whole thing to questions to our four panelists here, and see what they have to say in response to your inquiries. And we'll start off by asking if alternative A is chosen, will the full 7.5 million of new development be approved per the North Potomac Small Area Plan?
The answer to the question about North Potomac Yard is no. The full $7.5 million was contingent upon the metro station being there, and that amount of density drops between 3 and 4 million square feet if it's a no-build alternative or alternative A.
That is true. However, two things to take into consideration. One is the developer has already approached the city and said they would like to, quote, renegotiate the entire option B package and come in with a small area plan change. Probably, I'm guessing they would like more residential. They've already made that plain. And the other thing is, if it is option A that's chosen, it's clear that it's going to have to be renegotiated, the whole thing. And they, lawyers representing the developers or the property owners have said they are willing to enter into that negotiation.
Yeah, I think Mark is correct. You wouldn't probably see the $7.5 million that was approved because option B would not be selected. However, I do think that you'd have to go back and renegotiate not only the amount of square footage but the developer contribution towards the package. But I would suspect that you know, the ownership interest of North Potomac Yards would probably not walk away from, you know, millions of square feet inside the beltway of development potential. Whether it's, I don't think it would be the whole 7.5, but I think it would be a significant percentage of the 7.5.
Next question. Next question. I'm not sure what this means. How far apart in feet between stations A and B? In other words, how far apart are they? If you
I think it's approximately 200 yards. Is that 200 feet? Oh, sorry, it's not even 2 football fields. I mean, it's very close. Okay, go.
What's the nuance?
The nuance is that if you compare, if you're comparing, that's the answer if you're comparing the southern end of one station with the northern the other. If you look at the how much the station moves north, the north end to north end is 900 feet, which is about 3 blocks. So that in effect it is and it puts the station closer to where the density is in Potomac Yard.
The real way, one of these things is based primarily on research and studies, and most of these studies, it's you have to be careful how you do studies. To give you an example, if I go out and measure the effect of bicycle trails and go down to Mount Vernon Avenue Parkway or the George Washington Memorial Parkway and start measuring the value of the houses along the trail, I can easily be misled into thinking that's the trail that's causing the property value increase. Not necessarily so. It could also be the fact that they have view of the Potomac. So when you do these things, you have to be very careful to factor all things in. And one of the things is, Carrie mentioned Route 1, Potomac Avenue, BRT. Those are actually negatives because those are alternatives. So once you have alternatives in place, they start diminishing the value. The other thing is, the distance is, I calculated it, but I had to do it by kind of gadgetry. I came to 300 feet distance between the midpoint of A and B.
Probably the right way to do it.
And that is statistically insignificant, because the biggest problem facing this is going to be, in my neighborhood, we live fairly close to Braddock Metro Station. We have Route 1. It is a psychological barrier, total psychological barrier. And the same thing here, if you have to walk across way over there, it becomes problematic. So from this perspective, as to whether A or B is more worthwhile, I think they come out even for the developer's perspective, or the property owner. I don't think the distance makes that much of a difference. From the studies, 300 feet is irrelevant from statistical studies perspective.
I mean, normally when you're looking at development around a metro station, you want to concentrate your density within a half to a quarter mile of the metro station. And I would agree with Paul that the difference between the two stations, alternative A, alternative B, probably insignificant when you consider the actual walking distance. I mean, it's just not that great. And I think we can avoid some of the environmental problems that Paul and others have mentioned, with alternative A as opposed to alternative B.
I just want to elaborate on something Paul mentioned there. This BRT line, as many of you know, when you go over the Monroe Avenue Bridge, I get the question, what is that? So as many of you know, that's the BRT line that's going to run from Braddock Road to Crystal City Metro Station. So this stop that we're building is right there in between the two of those. That line is going to have 6-minute headways. It's going to be a very efficient system. So the other argument is if you end up if Potomac Yards goes more residential and there's less office space there, do we need to have the metro there if you can get off the metro at Braddock Road and take the BRT into Potomac Yards, or you get off at Crystal City and you jump on this $35 million line and you're in Potomac Yards that way. So that's the other argument that we're going to have to realize whether we're going to use that or not, depending on what option is picked.
Do you want me to do this one? Okay. How does capital financing a metro station impact bonding for other city needs? Example, sewer, stormwater, schools. Are there not limits on what level of indebtedness the city can assume?
I think there's a couple of answers to that question, or a couple of elements. Keep in mind that the repayment on the debt, and I think this is where Frank and I sort of have a little difference of opinion. The payment on the debt by design is not coming from our general revenue tax base, or at least the general citizens of Alexandria, our real property tax base. It's coming from the special taxing district that was established at Potomac Yard. It's coming from the net new taxes that are being generated, and it's coming from developer contributions. It's not part of the overall general obligation bond package, although it would be considered a general obligation bond. So that's the source of those revenues. I think that again, alternative A, by reducing the price, using the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's allocation of $66 million, reduces the price, reduces your interest carrying costs, reduces the overall indebtedness, and actually gets the bonds paid off faster than the $250 million that we originally projected. So it makes alternative A not only better from, at least in my opinion, from an environmental standpoint, but from a financial standpoint as well.
And in 2010, when we voted on the Potomac Yards plan and approved it, the special task districts, as Mr. Donnelly mentioned, were very important to putting this together, because the ultimate goal is to have it self-sustainable through the money we're getting from the Northern Virginia Transit Authority, through the special task districts, through the developer contributions. But if the commercial development doesn't come the way we hope it comes, then all of us are on the hook for the difference. Once we borrow the money, we have to repay the money. We hope these sources are going to repay it, but if not, then the general taxpayers.
And I would argue that without the metro station, that's one sure way to ensure that you won't get the commercial development that you need. Because it won't come. And you're going to see, if you don't have a metro station there, you're going to see more residential development, more demand for public services, and probably higher taxes, because it's not going to change the dynamic that I talked about earlier. Again, quite frankly, right now, there's basically an annual 2% deficit that we experience each year. And we're only going to solve that by expanding our commercial tax base, which over the last 10 years has actually declined from my time as mayor and from the goal of when the Mayor's Economic Sustainability Task Force, called for a 50-50 split.
To underscore the point about paying back the debt service and increasing the commercial tax base to do that, in discussions with various entities who are interested in office space in Potomac Yard, whether they be federal agencies through marketing what's in Land Bay H, which is a very large federal office building, where the reaction back to the brokers has been, let me know when they get from federal agencies, let me know when they've made a decision to start the station, because we'd lease that in a minute, given its location. Second of all, the Institute for Defense Analysis is at Mark Center. They want to move closer to the Pentagon. They want to move, they said, on to a metro station line somewhere. We competed with Arlington, and we won it in Potomac Yard, and the Institute of Defense Analysis said they're only basically going to pull the trigger and go to Potomac Yard once we've started the metro station. And there's a third business we've been talking to who's also basically very interested in Potomac Yard, but only if there's a metro station. The course of talking to commercial entities is real clear that for office, it's having a metro station there makes it an enormously attractive place. Having no metro station there means we'll end up with a bunch of apartments.
One thing is, I calculated my taxes. I do this periodically and hand it to.
Better do it at least once a year.
Well, Connie does that, but and I hand it over to City Council, and it keeps growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And I've made the point that I have no problem. I have no concern about paying that if we are heading in the right direction. I think Kerry brought it up and said there's structural imbalance. I think this city needs to reevaluate the way it does business. I do not believe that we can compete with Arlington and Fairfax in the way this reliance on development. In my community, we've been the beneficiaries of all this development. And it's taken a toll on us. It really has. And in many places in this city, they live the same, it looks the same as it did 30, 50 years ago, no change. But come to my neighborhood, and you'll see it has been significant and substantial. That's a total change for us. That, in my estimation, at some level is a cost. So how do we move forward? Now, I think one of the key problems here is that what kind of community and society are we creating? Mark mentioned the Institute of Defense Analysis, which moved from BRAC down to Potomac Yard. They came in and said, well, we want two stories above grade parking. Okay, so we created 2 stories of parking garage above grade. Is that a community that will invite people to come in? Is that a walkable community? I have a study in front of me that says the walkability premium in commercial real estate investments is significant. But we're not doing that. I mean, I think we, as a community, need to sit down and have a thorough discussion about this whole way we're doing business. I had a conversation with a council member and said, maybe we can't afford to pay 3.2% pay wage increase to all the city staff. But the mandate from city council to the city manager was provide them pay raise, provide the school what it wants, and do the CIP. That doesn't leave much left over. It kind of resembles the discussion they're having on Capitol Hill, only here. And I would urge that we, as a community, work through this and come up with a model that sort of more closely resembles what the assets we have in this town, as opposed to trying to emulate Fairfax and Arlington in their model, because I'm not sure it's going to work in the long run.
This question is for Mr. Jenks. Will not the 20% surtax on yard developments not discourage people from buying there?
The special tax, there are two special taxes that have been approved in Potomac Yard. One is the 20-cent tax, which may have been what was referred to. That applies to North Potomac Yard.
This one here.
South Potomac Yard, which is more residential, is 10 cents extra. That hasn't gone into effect. The people who bought in South Potomac Yard knew that in the real estate documents and are looking forward to the metro station being constructed. The city's tax rate is, we chose 20 cents in a sense. Partly it's how much money can you earn, but second of all, it's what kind of rate can you add on and still be competitive. And fortunately, the city's tax rate compared to our neighbors is relatively competitive, and 20 cents would not make a difference to most people in deciding where to buy.
Just quickly, the last PIMEC meeting, which Carrie Donnelly is a member of, citizens actually showed up and asked Mayor Yule, what's this about? We have to pay more money in taxes. The first people that encountered this tax was Potomac Greens. Boy, did they object to it. Personally, I think it's a bad idea to start doing differentiation in taxation. If infrastructure is to be put in place, that's a community issue, and the community ought to pay for it. But I think it's only a matter of time before the citizens that are moving into Potomac Yard come down to City Hall, whether it's in Old Town or somewhere else, but and really start objecting to them having to pay a significantly different, because 10% is significantly different.
Okay, next question. The wetlands are tidal. Is the EPA involved in developing the EIS?
The responsibility for wetlands rests with the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and they have been a participant at the table in regards to the environmental impact statement process to date.
Next question. Is option A preferred by all of you?
Well, compared to the other candidate build alternatives, because that's what's in the table, as Mark mentioned, we went through a screening process where 36 different candidate build alternatives were identified. Those are then boiled down to 3, which was the current reservation, A, which has always been part of the reservation and planned upon, B, which was part of the Potomac Yard North Small Area Plan, D, which you saw is really not, while it's technically feasible, probably does have some I think some technical challenges, but it also is financially just not viable. So I think at the end of the day, you're really sort of left with candidate build A, which number 1 is cheaper. Number 2 can be financed at a lower cost than what we projected, which removes a lot of the uncertainty, and is one that can be done expeditiously. And as I mentioned, I think the sooner we get this going, the better it is for us to grow our revenue base. I mean, if we want to continue to go down the path that we've been going on for the last 8 years, we're going to see increased taxes. We're going to see reductions in services because our tax base is not growing. The only way we can finance both the services that we want and provide some tax relief is through expansion of our commercial tax base. I demonstrated it with the Patent and Trademark Office. You know, when we realized the full revenue of the Patent and Trademark Office, what happened? Our tax rate fell 10 cents on the dollar.
if this is going to work, CSX isn't going to help us. The National Park Service isn't going to help us. So the reality is the city council, if they're going to move on an option, it has to be option A. And once they decide that, then what's going to happen, the developers are going to want to come back and try to rework the deal. So what we need to do now is the city council needs to go out and say, hey, if we're going to build it, it's going to be option A. Then what the community needs to do over the next 9 to 12 months, see what the rework deal is that the builders want to do, and then where's the money, and is this financial model still sustainable? And that's when the city council needs to make the decision whether to build a metro or not.
In my perspective, option B is absolutely unacceptable. It just destroys the Parkway view shed. And for that reason, I've always objected to it. As to whether or not option A, I think Frank explained it very eloquently, which is we have not seen sufficient scientific evidence, aside from CARE's passionate speeches for it. But the fact that we have a BRT, the fact that we have alternatives there, it depends entirely what the developer is willing to put in. Now, when you have a BRT, new studies are coming in and showing that it's very preferable to put in condos. If they're putting in condos anyway and coming in and saying, we don't want to do commercial, we want to do condos, then there's absolutely no point in doing Metro Station A. So those are things that really need to be hammered out before a decision by City Council.
This whole process started with the 2010 rezoning in North Potomac Yard with the station location at about where alternative B is at the current point. That's what started the EIS process. That's what basically produces the most, in a sense, of benefit for the city. The EIS process is aimed at finding out what the negatives are, seeing if those can be mitigated, and then making a decision. So I think in staff's mind, we're working through that, and as we get all those facts on the table, and as we see what mitigation, if any, can be done on the various other alternatives, then that'll point to a specific decision. Should also point out that any of these alternatives, including alternative A, can be challenged later if the environmental impact statement isn't thorough on every single solitary option. So that's staff's responsibility at this point, is to do a thorough analysis of all the options. So regardless of which options gets chosen, it's defensible in effect if it was challenged by anybody. And as far as any of the alternatives, there are people on both sides of every single one of these alternatives, so we want to make sure that the analysis is vetted very well.
Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to our chairperson, Russ Bailey.
Okay, Mike and Roger, thanks much. And thanks to all of our panelists, Mark, Poole, Carey, and Frank. It was a great evening. This is our hot topic this year. Maybe it'll be our hot topic in 2015. So let's give them another round of thanks. And we hope to see you all back here next month when Judge Nolan Dawkins is our speaker. Thank you much.